Augustus Albee stood in front of the full-length mirror in his apartment above the antique shop, adjusting his tricorn hat to precisely the right angle. The blue wool coat with its brass buttons caught the afternoon light. The white breeches were freshly pressed, and the buckled shoes, though uncomfortable, completed the ensemble perfectly. He looked exactly like a town crier from 1744. Of course, he was a town crier. Self-appointed, perhaps, but the role suited him. Someone had to maintain proper historical standards in Gull'sHaven, and who better than a classically trained actor who'd performed in actual theaters in New York City? Augustus checked his pocket watch, an authentic antique he'd acquired shortly after moving to Gull'sHaven 5 years ago, 3:45. The tour began at 4, which meant he needed to be at the cemetery by 3:55 to greet the early arrivals. Punctuality was the mark of a professional. He picked up his battery-powered lantern, tested it once, twice, then grabbed his leather-bound script. He had the tour memorized, naturally, every word, every dramatic pause, but the script added authenticity. Augustus descended the narrow stairs from his apartment and emerged onto Main Street. October in Gull'sHaven was glorious, the kind of crisp fall afternoon that made tourists point their cameras at everything. The leaves were at peak color, the harbor sparkled in the distance, and Main Street looked like a postcard of coastal New England. Perfect weather for a ghost tour. He made his way up Main Street toward the church, his buckled shoes clicking on the sidewalk. A few locals called out greetings. Mrs. Henderson from the library waved from across the street. Tom, a local fisherman, nodded as he passed. Augustus tipped his hat to each of them with theatrical flourish. The cemetery beside the Main Street church was already gathering tourists. Augustus could spot them easily, the bright windbreakers, the expensive cameras, the comfortable walking shoes. A family of 4, an elderly couple, several groups of friends, and a few solo travelers. They milled around the entrance, reading the historical marker, taking photos of the old headstones. But there were also more locals than usual, Augustus noticed with satisfaction. Several people in period dress were already mingling with the tourists. A few days earlier, Augustus had been featured in a tourism magazine, and excitement about his ghost tour has been steadily growing. Unbeknownst to Augustus, word of the tour had spread beyond the usual tourist channels. Over the past week, it had reached the ghosts of Gull'sHaven who planned to attend. They found ghost tours entertaining, truth appreciated, invention corrected. Augustus had no idea ghosts existed, let alone that they were in his audience. To him, the people in period dress were simply enthusiastic historical society volunteers. Augustus checked his watch. 3:57. Close enough. He strode to the center of the group, raised his lantern high despite the broad daylight, and called out in his best stage voice that he was Augustus Albee, Town Crier of Gull'sHaven, and he welcomed them to the historic ghost tour. Several tourists jumped, startled. A few laughed. Most immediately pulled out their phones to record. Augustus continued, warming to his audience, explaining they were about to embark on a journey through the shadowed history of this ancient coastal settlement. They would hear tales of the departed who walked among them still, of tragedies and mysteries that echoed through the centuries. They would learn which spirits were benevolent, which were restless, and which, he paused dramatically, were best left undisturbed. An elderly woman in a purple fleece jacket raised her hand timidly, asking if it was scary. Augustus softened his tone and assured the madam that their ghosts were of the historical variety, more melancholy than menacing, though he couldn't promise she wouldn't feel a chill or two as they walked these haunted streets. What Augustus didn't notice, standing as he was with his back to the cemetery, was that several figures had quietly joined the group. An older gentleman in a captain's coat from the 1840s stood near the back. A young woman in a colonial dress, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, smiled at something the elderly tourist had said. A fisherman in clothes that looked weathered by decades of salt spray leaned against the cemetery fence. Augustus opened his script with a flourish. He explained that their tour began here, in this hallowed ground, where many of Gull'sHaven's earliest settlers rested. Or did they? He let the question hang. He would tell them about Patience Thornwood, who died in 1783 and was said to haunt the church itself. Many had reported seeing her ghostly figure in the windows late at night, searching for her husband who was lost at sea. A voice from the back of the group said that wasn't quite right. Augustus looked up, slightly annoyed at the interruption. A woman he didn't recognize, maybe in her 60s, wearing what looked like an authentic period dress, was smiling at him pleasantly. The woman explained that Patience Thornwood wasn't in the church. She'd moved on properly when they found her husband's body and buried him next to her. Gave her peace, you see. It was Margaret Ashford who was in the church, and she wasn't really haunting it. She just liked to attend services. Several tourists laughed, thinking this was part of the show. Augustus frowned. He didn't recall hiring any actors for today's tour, though the dress was impressive. Maybe this was one of the Historical Society volunteers? They'd been very supportive of his tours. Augustus decided to roll with it, noting that local lore did vary from source to source. But his research into the historical records, the woman interrupted again, excited to tell everyone she was there when it happened. Patience was ever so relieved when they found Thomas, she said. Cried for days, but then she was able to rest. The tourists were eating this up, taking photos of the woman in period dress. Augustus decided this was actually enhancing the tour, even if it was historically inaccurate according to his sources. He made a mental note to have a word with the Historical Society about coordinating better. Augustus said with theatrical graciousness that he stood corrected by local tradition. They should move on to the next location. He led the group out of the cemetery and down a side street, Elm Street, where several historic houses stood behind white picket fences. The tourists followed eagerly, cameras clicking. The people in period dress, and there seemed to be more of them now, followed along as well. Augustus stopped in front of a particularly beautiful colonial-era home, painted yellow with black shutters. He explained this was the Wickham House, built in 1762. It was said that during the Revolutionary War, a British officer was hidden here by the Wickham family, who took pity on the young man despite his allegiance to the crown. When revolutionary forces discovered him, they hanged him from that very oak tree. Augustus pointed dramatically at the large tree in the front yard. His ghost was said to walk the property still, forever grateful to the Wickhams for their kindness, even as he mourned his untimely death. The tall man in the captain's coat said from the back that this was not true at all. Augustus blinked, assuring the man that this had been thoroughly researched. The man stepped to the front of the group, proclaiming that no British officer was ever hidden here. The Wickhams were fierce patriots. They wouldn't have sheltered a British officer if their lives depended on it. Augustus asked then where that story had originated. The man shrugged, explaining some tour guide made it up about 40 years ago. Sounded good, he supposed. The real history was that the Wickhams hid a French deserter from the Continental Army, Jean-Baptiste something. He'd gotten tired of the war and wanted to go home. They fed him and gave him money for passage back to France. Not as dramatic, but true. Augustus asked how he knew this. The man said matter-of-factly that he'd helped him get to the ship. Captain Elwood, he added, tipping his hat. Pleasure to be on the tour. The tourists were delighted. One man in a Red Sox cap leaned toward his wife and whispered about how these town people really committed to the bit. That costume must have cost a fortune. Augustus decided to reassert control, thanking Captain Elwood for that colorful addition. Local oral history was indeed a valuable supplement to written records. Shall we continue? He led them along Elm Street to Oak Street, then down toward Main Street again, stopping at various locations. At each stop, someone in period dress would pipe up with corrections to his stories. The ghost of the ship's cook, who supposedly haunted the old inn? Actually, she just liked the food there and visited occasionally. the murdered sailor who walked the docks? Died peacefully in his sleep at 87, thank you very much, and took offense at being called murdered. By the time they reached Main Street proper, Augustus was thoroughly flustered, but trying not to show it. The tourists, at least, were having a wonderful time. They kept asking the people in period dress for photos, marveling at the authenticity of the costumes. Augustus stopped in front of the fire station, a handsome brick building with 2 large bay doors. He explained, consulting his script with some relief, since surely no one could dispute this one, that here they had the site of the Great Fire of 1887, which destroyed much of Main Street. 7 people perished in the flames, and their spirits were said to gather here each year on the anniversary, mourning their tragic fate. A young man interrupted. 8 people. 8 people, he corrected, and it was 1889, not 1887. Augustus stared at him, insisting his source was the Historical Society's own records. The young man said with a grin that the source made a typo. It happened all the time. But yeah, 8 people. They got the blacksmith's apprentice wrong in the records, listed him as escaped, but he actually died of smoke inhalation 2 days later. Augustus demanded to know how he could possibly know that. The young man shrugged, explaining his great-great-great-grandfather was the fire chief. It was family history. Augustus took a deep breath. This tour was not going according to plan, but the tourists seemed utterly enchanted, so perhaps it didn't matter. He soldiered on. At the pizza place, formerly a bakery, he told the story of the baker's ghost, who still needed invisible dough. A woman in a flour-dusted apron appeared from somewhere and cheerfully corrected him, noting that it wasn't invisible dough, she simply enjoyed remembering. There was a difference. At the old Blue House Inn, he described the ghostly woman in white who walked the 2nd floor. An elegant woman in a white dress waved from the back. That's me, she said. She was excited Augustus included her story, but pointed out that it wasn't much of a story. She just liked the view from up there. And the inn kept that room exactly as she remembered it. Very thoughtful of them. Everyone clapped with approval, and she acknowledged with a polite curtsy. By the time Augustus led the group down toward the waterfront, he'd given up trying to maintain historical accuracy and simply embraced the chaos. His audience had somehow grown even larger, and everyone was having a great time. They'd taken dozens of photos with the actors in period dress. Several had asked where the town got such good costumes. The sun was beginning to set as they reached the town dock. The harbor spread out before them, lobster boats bobbing gently at their moorings, and in the distance, Bull Island's lighthouse began its slow rotation, the beam catching the gathering dusk. Augustus positioned himself at the end of the pier, with his back to the water, and the tourists gathered in front of him. The people in period dress stood among the tourists or off to the sides. The scene was perfect, exactly as Augustus had envisioned when he first conceived the tour. He raised his lantern, which was actually useful now, in the dimming light. And now, he said, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper that carried across the water, he would tell them the most famous ghost story of Gull'sHaven, the tale of the Bull Island Ranger. A murmur went through the crowd. Augustus continued, explaining that in the 1950s and 60s, a man named Robert Finch served as the ranger on Bull Island. He maintained the lighthouse, preserved the historical buildings, and watched over that isolated place as if it were his own child. He was a quiet man, they say, dedicated to his duty. When the lighthouse was automated in 1967, his position was eliminated, but he continued to visit the island, unable to let it go. In 1969, while making one of these unofficial visits, he suffered a heart attack at the base of the lighthouse. He died alone, as he had lived, with only the gulls for company. Augustus paused, letting the tragedy sink in. But Robert Finch could not leave his island behind. To this day, 56 years after his death, people reported seeing him on Bull Island, a figure in a ranger's uniform, checking the buildings, walking the shore, forever maintaining the place he loved. Some had even claimed to meet him, to speak with him, to shake his hand, never realizing until later that they had encountered a ghost. The tourists were completely fascinated by what they were hearing. Several had their phones out, recording. One woman had tears in her eyes. Augustus raised his arm dramatically to point across the water, suggesting that if they looked now, they might see his boat, traveling to his island, where he continued his eternal watch. As if on cue, a small motorboat appeared from behind a nearby point, heading east toward Bull Island. The figure at the helm was too distant to see clearly, but the timing was perfect. The tourists gasped. Cameras clicked frantically. Someone asked if that was him, if that was Bob Finch. A voice from the back confirmed that it actually was him. Everyone there stared across the harbor, watching Bob and his boat grow smaller. The scene was almost surreal, and Augustus wondered how this was possible. It seemed too coincidental. Of course, with Bob Finch, there was no coincidence. Augustus Albee faced his audience, raised both arms, still holding the lantern, and took a sweeping bow. Everyone broke into applause and cheered his performance. The tour had been, despite all the interruptions and corrections, a complete success. The group lingered on the pier, waiting their turn to shake Mr. Albee's hand. Several swore it was the finest ghost tour they'd ever experienced. Augustus announced that their tour actually concluded at the Rusty Anchor, just there. He pointed to the bar 50 yards away, light spilling from its windows. He had arranged with the proprietor, Roy, for a special post-tour gathering with discounted appetizers. He would be available to sign tour programs and share additional stories over a drink. The crowd moved as one toward the Rusty Anchor. The people in period dress came too, mixing seamlessly with the tourists. When they entered, Roy was behind the bar, looking resigned to the chaos, but not unhappy about the business. Little Pete occupied his usual table, his large frame unmistakable even in the crowd. Linda was already working the room, taking drink orders in her flirtatious way. Slim got up from his usual stool at the end of the bar, preparing the kitchen for an influx of orders. The tourists scattered to find seats, excitedly discussing the tour. The people in period dress integrated seamlessly into the bar crowd. Augustus noticed that Captain Elwood was now deep in conversation with Little Pete, both of them laughing about something. Abigail was helping Linda deliver drinks, as if she worked there. Augustus made his way to the bar, where Roy poured him a whiskey neat without being asked. Roy commented that it looked to be a successful tour. Augustus confirmed it was, very much so. Though next time, he'd appreciate advance notice if the Historical Society was sending actors. Augustus mingled with the tourists, accepting compliments, discussing historical details, and carefully avoiding the actors who kept adding their own commentary. At one point, a tourist asked him if the people in costume were volunteers or paid actors. Augustus admitted that was an excellent question, realizing he genuinely didn't know. The Historical Society had been wonderfully supportive. He believed they were volunteers who shared his passion for preserving local history. This was what Augustus moved to Gull'sHaven for, to be appreciated, to share his theatrical gifts with people who understood art. The evening wore on, drinks flowed, and Slim did his best to keep up with the appetizer orders. The bar took on that comfortable buzz of a successful gathering. Augustus held court in the larger back room, tourists clustered around him, asking questions about other haunted locations in Maine. He was just describing the Thornwick Boatyard, its dark reputation and sinister atmosphere, when Linda appeared at his elbow. She asked if now was a good time for the special effects. Augustus blinked, noting he didn't arrange for any special effects. Linda said with a smile that Abigail mentioned it was her contribution. A thank you for including the real stories in the tour. Augustus hesitated. On one hand, he liked to be in control of his performances. On the other hand, the tourists would love it. He supposed that would be acceptable. What sort of special effects? Linda said he'd see, already moving away. Augustus turned back to his audience, announcing they had a special treat this evening. One of their local historians, Abigail, had prepared a demonstration of ghostly phenomena. The tourists perked up immediately. Several pulled out their phones again. Abigail's voice carried through the bar as she thanked Mr. Albee for the fantastic tour. In return, she said, she wanted to show everyone something special, a small demonstration of what ghosts could really do in Gull'sHaven. Linda and Little Pete slid some tables to the side, creating a stage in the middle of the room. Abigail took the space, explaining that the thing about ghosts was they weren't always what people expected. They weren't just shadows or cold spots or mysterious noises. Here in Gull'sHaven, they were part of the community. They ate, they drank, they told stories. She smiled. They even went on ghost tours. A few tourists laughed uncertainly. Augustus felt a flutter of unease. Abigail noted the trick to being a ghost was remembering what you were supposed to look like, especially the clothes. Clothes were tricky. And then, as Augustus, the tourists, and her fellow ghosts watched, Abigail's jeans and blouse flickered. For just a moment, she was wearing a long colonial dress. Then she was in a completely different modern outfit, a sundress. Then back to the jeans and blouse. The tourists gasped, hesitated, then applauded. They weren't expecting a professional magic show. Someone immediately asked how she was doing that. Augustus was frozen, his whiskey glass halfway to his lips. That wasn't a costume change. That was impossible. Abigail said, grinning now, that the other thing about being a ghost was they didn't always have to be visible. And then she began to fade. She became translucent, then barely there, then completely gone. The space where she'd been standing was empty. The bar erupted in applause. Tourists jumped to their feet, cheering. Someone shouted about mirrors. Another was looking at the ceiling, searching for projectors. A man in a fleece vest exclaimed how incredible it was, asking how she did it. His wife suggested mirrors, or maybe holograms. Augustus couldn't speak. His theatrical training told him to look for the trick, the hidden wires, the trap door. But there was nothing. Just an empty space where a woman had been standing. Then, back in the crowd, from directly behind him, Abigail's voice said cheerfully that the real trick was reappearing in a different spot. Augustus spun around. Abigail stood there fully solid, grinning at him. The tourists went wild, applauding, stamping their feet, demanding to know how it was done. Abigail gave an exaggerated bow, noting it was a trade secret. She'd just say Gull'sHaven had some special talents. Several tourists rushed to where she'd been standing, looking for hidden compartments in the floor. Others examined the area where she'd reappeared. Roy watched from behind the bar, a slight smile on his face. Little Pete was laughing, his large frame shaking. Captain Elwood raised his glass in salute. Augustus drained his whiskey in one gulp. The tourists broke into overlapping conversations, debating the mechanics of what they'd just seen. The people in period dress mingled and laughed. Abigail accepted compliments and deflected questions about her methods with practiced ease. Augustus found himself at the bar, gripping his second whiskey, watching the room spin with energy and amazement. His tour had been a success beyond anything he'd imagined. The special effects, whatever technology Abigail had used, was phenomenal. The Historical Society must have serious funding to pull off something like that. As he watched Abigail laugh with a group of tourists, still wearing that vintage blouse that looked genuinely old, not reproduction old, he felt a small nagging thought trying to surface. Something about Captain Elwood's costume that was too perfect. Something about the young man who knew impossible details about a fire from 1889. Augustus pushed the thought away. It was a successful tour. The tourists were happy. The tourism magazines would certainly hear about this. His tours would become the talk of coastal Maine. His acting prowess would finally be recognized. That was what really mattered. Abigail caught his eye from across the room and gave him a warm smile, raising her wine glass in a small salute. Augustus raised his whiskey in return. The elderly woman in the purple fleece approached him, gushing about how it was the most wonderful tour she'd ever taken. The special effects at the end? Just incredible. She'd be recommending this tour to everyone she knew. Augustus thanked her graciously, slipping back into his Town Crier persona, and told her about next week's tour. She promised to tell her friends. Augustus accepted more compliments and encouraged people to leave reviews. By the time the bar had mostly emptied, returning to just the regulars, Augustus was feeling pleasantly fuzzy from the whiskey. Abigail sat at a corner table, talking with little Pete. Linda was counting her tips, and Slim was back to his motionless self, his cowboy hat tipped down just below his eyes. Augustus stood to leave, gathering his tricorn hat and lantern. Abigail called out that she'd see him next week. Augustus turned and assured her he'd be there. Same time, same place. Perhaps with even more tourists, given tonight's success. She said with a grin that she was counting on it. Augustus stepped out into the October night. He glanced at the lighthouse on Bull Island, making its steady rotation, wondering again about the ranger. He started walking up Main Street toward his apartment, his mind pleasantly occupied with thoughts of next week's tour. Perhaps he should add something about the special effects in his promotional materials, though he'd need to coordinate better with the Historical Society. Augustus reached his apartment, climbed the stairs, and carefully hung his costume in the closet. The tricorn hat went on its stand. The battery-powered lantern went back on the shelf, ready for next week. He fell asleep thinking about next week's tour, never quite catching the thought that kept drifting to the surface, that perhaps the past didn't need to be brought to life in Gull'sHaven. It had never really left. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please like and subscribe. Thank you.